Hi there, welcome to Rent Prep for Landlords. I'm Andrew Schultz, Community Manager here at Rent Prep. I'm also a licensed real estate broker in the state of New York with over 14 years of experience in the property management and rental property industries. On today's episode, we're going to be setting up new property managers and landlords for success. I'm going to be drawing from my experiences in real estate and property management throughout my career, and I want to target some bigger picture things that can help you as you start to advance through your career. We're going to be talking about both theory and practice over the course of a couple different videos. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's go ahead and start things off with some theory. There are two guiding principles that if you adopt these early in your business, things will naturally run a lot smoother for you over the course of time. At least that's been my experience in my career. The first principle is ABCDE. It's very, very simple. ABCDE. That stands for always be consistent, document everything. This is actually an extension of my previous version of this, which was document, document, document. Writing everything down is something that I learned very early on in my career in EMS before I transitioned over to real estate. Documenting what you did for the patient while you're with them is critical because once you drop that patient off at the ER, your care stops and they're not going to have access to you to ask you questions about what you did while you had the patient. So your documentation is critical at that point because that's the patient record. That's what people are going to reference when it comes time to figure out what happened between the time that you arrived on scene and the time you dropped that patient at the hospital. That documentation also becomes even more critical in the event that you have an issue where you need to go to court. Are you going to remember all of the details of a call that you ran sometimes several years ago? Probably not, which means that your documentation is even more important in a situation such as that. So let's talk about the broader principle of ABCDE. Always be consistent, document everything. I picked this up from Jamie Kane all the way back in podcast 170, where we were talking about emotional support animals and service animals. When you are consistent in how you operate and you document things that you're doing along the way, it certainly helps you in a lot of different ways in your business. For instance, when you have reference data from the past, it can be super useful when you're making decisions going forward. Thinking about historic pricing on projects that you've completed, or being able to compare vendors' pricing from one year to the next to determine if it's time to renegotiate, or maybe if it's time to start looking into different vendors, or even just being able to go back and reference information from several years ago. Silly stuff like what color paint did we use in that kitchen, or how old is the furnace in the basement of that house? Stuff like that becomes so much more easy to reference when you have historic data to go back to. Documentation and consistency also helps you when it's time to grow. If you've done a move-in on a unit and you've documented how you did that move-in, it should be very easy for a staff member to be able to step in and assist you as you grow because the groundwork is already there. We're going to be talking more about systems in another video, but documentation is one of the things that will lead you to being able to develop good systems. I cannot overstate enough the importance of being consistent in how you operate and documenting what you do. It's probably the number one piece of advice that I can give anybody at any level in any career. Now, let's move on to our next principle, which is law, lease, logic. You've probably heard me bring this up several times over the years because I honestly think that it's that important. If you can wrap your mind around law, lease, logic, and ABCDE, probably 80% of the problems that you face as a landlord or a property manager are going to sort themselves out. So what exactly is law, lease, logic? Law, lease, logic is the order of operations that you should be using when you're making decisions inside your rental property as it has to do with your tenants and things of that nature. In any given situation, you can determine what the law says, you can determine what your lease says, and you can determine what logic would dictate makes the most sense in that situation. From there, you can pretty much start working to resolve the problem. So obviously this needs a little bit more explanation. We start with law because law will automatically supersede a lease document, and honestly, in some instances, law is going to supersede what makes sense logically. Law doesn't always make sense logically. We all know that. There are a lot of laws that get passed that certainly don't make sense, and we have to deal with that because law is the thing that everyone is going to go back to and reference first. If you are attempting to do something in your business, you need to ensure that it's legal to do so. That's part of operating as a professional. Okay, I think that makes sense. I think everybody understands that, but how does this apply to rentals on a broader scope? Well, if you're updating your lease, for instance, and you're adding a bunch of new language into it that is in violation of the law in your state or federal or even local law, those clauses may get thrown out in court, or your entire lease could be invalidated, depending on the laws in your state and how the judge is feeling on any given day. So it's important to note that you want to have a good understanding of law before you start making edits to legal documents, because ultimately, if you're not an attorney, that's something that you might be doing in error and putting yourself in a much worse situation than what you started off in. Even beyond that, it's your responsibility as a housing provider to understand the laws in the areas that you're operating in, and you can't be out there in the field just doing whatever you want. So if you don't have a strong grasp on the landlord-tenant laws in your area, you're really in a position where you need to be doing some more research on some more learning before you jump into this industry. This is the type of industry where mistakes can be very, very, very costly. Oftentimes, fines will start in the tens of thousands of dollars range, and they only climb from there. So it's important to understand what you're doing. In addition, there's a lot of regulation that we have to follow, from landlord-tenant law to general business law, building code, fair housing law, and so many more. I understand that it's impossible to know every single rule and regulation out there. Having a solid knowledge base to draw from, as well as knowing where to go to be able to research the things that you don't know, it's going to go a long way in helping you to be successful as a landlord or as a property manager. Now, the second part of law lease logic is the lease. Your lease document is going to govern the business relationship between you and your tenant. Obviously, it's going to contain things like the leased property address, the rent amount, the security deposit amount, all the other critical points that you would expect to hit in any lease document, but it's also going to be used to lay out the terms and conditions of the tenancy that aren't otherwise specified in law. So in the absence of a law, your lease contract will dictate how the parties are supposed to act. For instance, when and how a security deposit needs to be returned is handled in state law in our state in New York. But in New York State, they don't have a lot of specification as to how lawn and snow removal is supposed to be handled. That means that in this instance, your lease would dictate who's responsible for the lawn care and who's responsible for the snow removal. And not having that in your lease will absolutely lead to headaches when the lawn doesn't get cut or when the sidewalks don't get shoveled. Having a well-rounded lease is important for your rental operations. Broad or incomplete leases can turn into problems for you or your tenants very, very quickly, and this can become especially tricky when something isn't written into the lease. A good example of this would be a kiddie pool or something of that nature. Many tenants will want to install kiddie pools in the backyard, and our response is always a firm no because of the potential liability. If you don't have a lease clause that says no swimming pools or no modifications to the yard, you may be in a situation where you now need to argue with your tenant rather than just pointing to a lease clause and saying, sorry, you agreed to it when you moved in. Their stance is that this isn't a thing that's prohibited by the law or by the lease. Your stance is that it should be prohibited because there's too much liability there, and not having it in your lease is going to put you at a disadvantage because now you have to have that discussion or argument in some instances with the tenant over something that probably should have been included in the lease in the first place. If it's something that you want the tenant to do or not to do, they may be inclined to simply ignore you because what they want isn't necessarily the same as what you want. So making sure that everyone is aligned by having everyone agree to the terms in the lease agreement goes a long way. Finally, logic should dictate the decisions that law and lease don't already. And there are instances where what the law says and what your lease say may be contrary to what makes sense logically. Something to consider when talking about logic is the expression, the right thing is always the right thing. That's something that I firmly believe in, and I carry it with me on a daily basis. Logic also helps you find win-win scenarios whenever possible, such that all parties involved are going to benefit from the decision being made rather than someone taking a loss in a situation. As an example, let's talk about a tenant who needs to break their lease because they've lost their job and simply put, they cannot afford this apartment anymore. We're going to assume this tenant is on a 1-year lease and that they have 9 months or so remaining. So, law, lease, logic. Legally, this tenant is obligated to finish out this tenancy including paying all of the rent, the utilities, etc. There's a signed lease, terms are agreed to, everything is cut and dry, black and white. What are the options at this point? Well, you can wait until they default on the rent and then evict them. This is going to consume both time and money. And the entire time you're in that eviction scenario, you aren't going to be getting paid for that apartment. So while legally eviction is an option, is it the best one here? So what if you didn't go down the legal path immediately? What if you took a look at the lease and discovered that, hey, this lease actually has language in it that will allow the tenant some options to get out of their lease? Some of the common options that we've seen are having the tenant find an approved sublet, having the tenant pay a lease break fee, which is typically pretty substantial, and it usually helps to offset some of the costs of the landlord, or leave the tenant responsible for the unit in full until such time that a new tenant moves in. Now, again, some states are going to have laws on this, so you need to do some research. But for the purposes of our discussion here today, we do have some options for the tenant to be able to break this lease and move forward with their life with minimal harm to both the tenant and to the landlord. So now you're able to have a discussion with this tenant and try to find a win-win scenario rather than a lose-lose scenario, which is what you're going to be facing in the event of an eviction. Okay, so where does the logic factor in here? Let's say that your lease does not have any language in it on how to go about breaking the lease. For the longest time, our lease did not have lease break language. The lease is the lease is the lease, and we're going to hold you to it, to the letter, no matter what. But when there is no letter, that's when you need to start employing a little bit of logic. In the scenario we're discussing here, if you don't have any language in your lease on how to go about breaking it, and there are no laws in your states with how a tenant could go about breaking a lease, you've reached a point now where logic has to dictate the next move, where logic has to take over. You have a tenant that you know is not going to be able to pay you. Does it make sense to drag this tenant through eviction court and cost both the tenant and you, or your landlord if you're a third-party property manager, a bunch of time and a bunch of money? No, definitely not. You wind up with a judgment that you likely aren't going to collect on anyway, and the tenant winds up with a record that follows them around forever. This is a lose-lose scenario for both parties. Sure, when someone purposely non-pays for months and months and months and ignores you all the way through the court process, that's probably what you're going to want, and I can certainly understand that. But when someone is coming to you and being upfront about their situation, you can choose that hardline path, or you can choose to work with someone, find a way to let them out of that obligation or to restructure that obligation, find a new tenant, and keep moving forward. This typically results in less overall time and money lost, in my experiences anyway, and it returns control of the asset to you so that you can find a new paying tenant. Every situation is going to be different, and there are a lot of landlords out there that will absolutely pursue that tenant until the very bitter end. But sometimes taking a step back and reevaluating the situation with a clear mind will show you that logically what you're doing doesn't make any sense. The right thing is always the right thing. So there you have it, some of the best theoretical advice I can give on property management and real estate investing. As I mentioned, this is the first in a multi-part video series. In our next video, we're going to be talking more about developing systems to help you operate. We'll talk a little bit about different software packages and why it's so critical to choose the right one, and other practical elements of the industry. Are you documenting things as well as you should? Drop us a comment down below and let us know if you think that you're on point or if there's some areas where you can stand to improve a little bit when it comes to your documentation. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm Andrew Schultz with ownbuffalo.com for rentprep.com, and we'll talk to you soon.